There are a variety of scenarios from here. No one knows where we go. And there are certainly some scenarios in which the damage remains tragic and upsetting, but limited. And there are other scenarios whereby certain key dominoes topple, and that starts a chain reaction which can lead to a regional conflagration and potentially even worse.
You say the potential threat to economies and markets will depend on the size and degree of the conflict itself, but how will the West be affected if the war expands?
Well, the real problem here is energy, because if the war expands into a geography which starts to impact energy production and energy supply, we risk rerunning the kind of crisis that we saw with Russian gas flows into Europe in 2022. And we hoped we'd put those episodes behind us. This year could potentially see a repeat.
What would have to happen for that eventuality to play out?
For that eventuality to play out, we would have to see the dominoes topple such that Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, other oil producers in that particular region would either end up at daggers drawn with each other in the absolute worst case scenario, or seeing significant US sanctions as a milder version of it, or some combination of the two. And were that to happen, plus additionally maybe the Suez Canal being affected in some subsets of some scenarios, we're looking at much higher global energy prices and much higher global inflation.
Let's talk about the price of oil. How high do you see it climbing?
Well, our energy expert, Joe DeLaura, believes that in the kind of scenarios we're looking at here, it's a minimum of $150 a barrel, a minimum. And if you start looking at some of the really worst case scenarios whereby on top of this, geopolitical actors like Russia say, okay, this would be a good time to turn the taps off as well, just to, kick a man while he's down, so to speak, it could be even higher than that.
How would the scenario which you are depicting interrupt other key commodity supplies?
Well, if the Suez Canal in particular is affected, that certainly can slow down the delivery of many commodities. They couldn't go through that key trade conduit. They'd have to go around the Horn of Africa. And even there, if we're getting into a truly global conflagration, or at least a global standoff, you have to wonder, would even the Horn of Africa be safe, either from pirates or from potential naval activity from other parties? So it's entirely inflationary, and the only question is just how bad it gets, how fast, were that to occur.
China signed a 25-year cooperation deal with Iran in 2020. If Iran enters the Israel-Gaza war, is China likely to become involved too?
Not directly. I don't think anyone's expecting the Chinese military to be projecting force to that region. That's something they're not capable of yet. But as we've seen in recent years, there are plenty of ways that actors can lean heavily in terms of economic pressure to make things much more painful for countries that are trying to prosecute a war, as we saw in 2022.
And so, indirectly, what could you see from China if this scenario was to play out?
Well, first of all, we already see one happening as I'm speaking to you today, which is that in the South China Sea, there's a standoff now between Philippines forces and Chinese forces. What they're attempting to do is see, will the US show that it still has the metal, and literally the metal, METAL, to stand behind the Philippines when it's being sucked in on two different fronts simultaneously? Can it do it on three? And at the same time, in a more passive sense, China could suddenly have a problem with production in certain key plants. It could have a problem supplying us with key inputs X, Y, Z, A, B, C, which would be very disruptive for our production processes and inflationary again. Maybe that could happen.
You raise a very interesting point. Is the US going to be able to support itself if called on in three separate conflicts?
Well, the US likes to think of itself as the arsenal of democracy, and it's still the world's primary military power. But if you're talking potentially about an escalation in the Ukraine war, requiring more and more US physical support, if you're talking about a worst-case scenario of a Middle East war dragging in many countries at the same time, requiring US firefighting ability, as it were, and if you're talking about the US being tested in the Indo-Pacific at exactly the same time, there are limits to even what the US can do, particularly in an election year.
Australia's PM is meeting Joe Biden this week and China's President Xi in a fortnight. The timing of his meetings with key players aside, does it appear to you as though the Australia-China trade war is drawing to an end?
Yes and no. I think we can see that certain key products may see tariffs lowered, and that's good news for Australia if that's the case. But anyone who thinks we're moving towards an era of, free trade, free hugs and free love is very, very wrong. The global backdrop is moving depressingly in the complete opposite direction, and I don't think that bilateral relationship will prove immune to that trend in the long run.
What do you see then as to the future of the relationship between China and Australia?
Well, we're in a period of global fragmentation, very clearly. It's happening faster in some regions than in others, and it's happening more aggressively in some regions than others. And we've obviously seen a very aggressive China-Australia dynamic over the past few years. So if we have partial détente on that front, fantastic. But as we saw in the previous Cold War between the US and the USSR, you had periods of détente, and then you had periods of much more heated confrontation or Cold War confrontation. And sadly, I expect with the present backdrop and the fact that China seems to be on one side in particular, this will just reoccur. And I think most key players in the industries affected are well aware of that fact.